Many people are interested in the idea of making puzzles, but find it a little bit daunting if they haven't tried it before, or think that making puzzles is very difficult. Today I'm going to discuss how you make puzzles in general. I'm going to focus on Mario Maker, but everything I'm going to say is going to apply to like any other platform, like Game Builder, Garage, or related. In order, I'm going to discuss the types of puzzle difficulty, the main procedures that you use to make a puzzle, the main things you'll want to do in a puzzle level, main things to avoid in a puzzle, and some closing notes. First, we need to talk about puzzle difficulty. The primary goal of a puzzle is to make the player feel smart. If a puzzle does not make the player feel smart, it is trash. Obviously, some people are better at puzzles than others, and so your experience is going to vary from player to player, but overall, your goal has to be to kind of get the player to the point where they feel smart. A lot of people go into making a puzzle level trying to make a really convoluted mechanism that, you know, I'm so smart that I made something so complex, right, that has a specific solution. But you don't just want to make something that's like a convoluted mess, all right? You want to make something that the player can eventually navigate. So first, for a puzzle level, you generally want to have it be not too hard, that's just frustrating. Generally, people don't have fun just like hitting their head against the wall for an hour. You also don't want to go in the opposite direction where a puzzle is too easy and then it's just boring, tedious, like you do the thing that's obvious and you keep going. Additionally, puzzles have three main different types of difficulty: analysis, observation, and memory. Analysis is what you think of mostly when you think of a puzzle level, all right? Analysis is, you know, you have the information already and you just need to put the puzzle pieces together. So here, for example, let's say I want the P-switch, but I can't get the P-switch because there's a snake block in the way. Therefore, I need to activate the snake block in order to get the P-switch. This cause and effect reasoning is the hallmark of analysis type difficulty. This is where you're focusing on deduction. The second main type of challenge in a puzzle level is observation, where the player has to notice something or observe something and then use that to gain new information. So here, for example, in its purest form, observation is in a spot the difference level. Like here, the right one is different, and so that is the one that leads to victory. You might say spot the difference isn't exactly a puzzle, and one, you're wrong. Two, usually observation gets mixed in as a part of a bigger overarching puzzle, and we have to be especially cautious about the contribution of observation when there's other things in the level that give noise. The third major type of puzzle difficulty is memory, where you have to see something and remember it for later. And in its purest sense, it would be like this puzzle level right here, where you have to remember which is the right block combination in the previous screen. Again, here it's in a stripped down, purified form, but usually it's going to take the form of remembering other parts of a puzzle level that you did before or that you saw before to progress. While there can be other types of difficulty in a puzzle level, these are the main ones that we want to really be aware of. From here on out, I'm going to focus primarily on puzzles that want to focus on analysis, on deductive reasoning, because those are the ones that people are usually most interested in making. For these types of puzzles, the best part is usually when the player finally understands the whole question, they understand all the puzzle pieces and needs to just stop and think to put the pieces together. In theory, you want the player to spend some amount of time in this state, enough that they're actually thinking, but not so long that it's frustrating. And this is because usually the end result is a eureka moment when the player finally figures out, ah, this is how you solve the level. Now that we know what we're aiming for, I'm going to show you the two main ways to actually construct a puzzle. The two main ways are thinking backwards, normally called backwards induction, and thinking forwards, which is like assembling different setups and chaining them together. First, we have backwards induction, which is usually the way that you can make the best puzzle levels. Before, I was showing you one of my puzzle levels, which is based on snake blocks. So here's the process by which I made it. So first, let's start a sequence-based puzzle being made by backwards induction. So we start with the last step that we're going to make first. So here, I'm going to start with a snake block in order to get to the door. The door sends me to the goal, and that's victory. That's only really one step, and that's not much of a puzzle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add one additional step to get to the snake block. Now I need to grab the POW in order to have enough height in order to reach the door. 2 steps isn't much of a puzzle, so let's add an additional step where we have to take the snake block to go through the bumper in order to get the POW, in order to activate the snake block and go through the door. And like this, we can steadily build up a sequence-based puzzle, just going from step A gets you to step B, to C, to D, until we get to the goal. One crucial thing is that when you construct a puzzle like this, because every step is solvable, you are just adding a step to get to the solution that you just made on the previous step. One of the main advantages of backwards induction is that you just keep adding more and more steps to make a puzzle more complex until you have a desired puzzle difficulty, or for a target puzzle length. The other main way to make a puzzle level is to think forwards, which is to make a specific small little setup that has a specific way to clear it, and then have it as a separate little sub-puzzle of a level. Here, for example, this is one separate small sub-puzzle, which is mostly separated from the rest of the level. And the right side of the puzzle level is a pair of two sub-puzzles also strung together. The main reason that why you'd want to think forward and make a little contraption and then put it into a level is if you want to really show off a specific mechanic, and you really want that mechanic to show up in your puzzle. Usually thinking forwards will lead to a large amount of playtesting, de-cheesing, etc. to combine the different sub-puzzles together, but that is the way that you'd go for thinking forwards. If you're new to making puzzle levels, I generally recommend you think backwards instead. Now that we understand the two main ways to kind of build up a puzzle level, let's talk about what you should actually do to make a good puzzle level. First is to kind of avoid a purely linear puzzle. So the way I described backwards induction before, you get A lets you go to B, goes to C, goes to D, goes to the goal, etc. So here, for example, hit the POW, which lets you hit the P switch, which lets you hit the on-off switch, which lets you go in the door. This is fine and all, but usually a linear level structure isn't quite as interesting as one that kind of branches off. Here we have a more interesting branching structure, where you have to basically solve each individual sub-puzzle. Like here, you have to do one sub-puzzle to get the key, and a different step in order to open the door. You can do them in either order, and eventually they reconvene in order to let you go in the key door. Usually a branching structure like this will make a puzzle much more interesting. Furthermore, you can make a much more interesting puzzle if you reuse similar puzzle pieces at different points. As an example of reusing the same course part multiple times, this seesaw is used in this puzzle level at least 4 different times in different ways. The seesaw is used once to enter the P door that leads to victory, a separate time to get the stump over here to go into this door, another time as ground to enter this door, and as a final time to position objects differently. Usually using that puzzle piece over and over and over again in multiple different ways will keep the puzzle simple enough that you don't have a bunch of different parts to keep track of, and it's kind of like brings out the most unique aspects of that little puzzle piece. This brings me to my next point, which is theming. Usually you want your puzzle to be about something or have some sort of idea. We're not going to put just a bunch of random setups, right? Like just like in any other level, you don't just want to put a bunch of random maneuvers in it, right? You want them to be related in some way. So here, for example, everything in the puzzle level is related by its relationship to the P switch and the seesaw. And if it does not have to do with the P switch and seesaw, then it's not really on topic. Theming is normally good for a couple of different reasons. First, it gives you a lot of ideas on what to focus on so you can find setups that are relevant to each other to make a good level. And second, it gives the player an increasing familiarity with a certain type of puzzle piece because they keep using that piece multiple times, and you can use that one puzzle piece in more exotic ways, a little bit differently each time, and make something that's not just completely generic. This brings me to my next point, which is you want to always give a very clear winning condition to the player. So here, when you look at this level, it's really obvious that in order to win, you need to go through this P door in order to touch the flagpole. All right, so then the entire level becomes based around how do we get into this P door. Okay, in this puzzle level, we don't see the flagpole explicitly, but it's pretty reasonable to infer that the key door that doesn't have another key door on screen, it has to go somewhere, and it has to go somewhere outside of the one screen of the level. As a result, the key door provides a very clear condition where the player looks at the screen and they realize in order to beat the level, you gotta go through that key door that takes you out of the puzzle. Sometimes you can be very explicit with a clear condition. Here I can touch the flagpole, but it's meaningless because I don't have the clear condition, I still have to kill one Goomba. So now I understand that in this level, the victory condition is to kill a Goomba. This brings me to my next point, which is normally when we build a puzzle, we want to keep as much of the information on screen as possible so that we don't have to look around the puzzle in order to see what we have to do. The main reason for this is that there is so-called memory type difficulty where you have to remember the other parts of the level. And if the level is actually very complex, then that's an issue. Like, in the interest of keeping all the information on screen, there are two main formats to making puzzle levels. One is one-screen puzzles, like the ones I've been showing you, where you can see everything on screen so you don't have to remember anything. Everything you see is right in front of you, or a puzzle gauntlet. A puzzle gauntlet is a series of one-screen mini puzzle rooms so that you go to each individual sub-puzzle, you beat that little puzzle, and then you go to the next one. And so a puzzle gauntlet you can see more in one of my main puzzle guides for the Stumpy Stumps level. If you have a mechanic that can be really convoluted or very specific, weird, like there's a lot to it, I highly recommend you go for a puzzle gauntlet, because in a puzzle gauntlet you get to teach the player a little mechanic in each individual room as they solve mini puzzles that are in a more controlled and isolated environment. So the player learns something from the first room so that then they can use that in the second room, and the information from the second room they can use in the third room, and so on and so forth. While you can use weird mechanics in one-screen puzzles, I highly recommend you don't, because normally you have to teach the player that mechanic, and that will consume some of the space, and you have to kind of like isolate it so that the player can understand it. You can pull it off, but one-screen puzzles are really bad at doing this. Like here, the only way that this puzzle level can work is if every mechanic that I use in this level is something that is already generally understood. Like, you understand when you go on a blue lava lift that it moves around on these tracks, and you can see it and you can observe it. Puzzle gauntlets are a lot better for isolating and teaching a specific mechanic, whereas a one-screen puzzle, you usually want to go with a bunch of mechanics that are all already pretty generally known or understood. One example of a level that does this well is in Dorley's Sun level, where one of the main mechanics is that you have to scroll up the screen by standing on a block that's that high in order to make the sun go a little bit higher. You do this a little bit early in the level, and it's in a controlled and isolated place, so you know you have to do it, and later that mechanic is used in one of the very final steps. Again, you can make it work, but if your mechanic has a lot to it, or is kind of difficult to discover or difficult to isolate, then you might want to consider a puzzle gauntlet or a tutorial room instead. Additionally, you almost always want a max timer in a puzzle level, because you don't really want the player to die. You want them to have as much time to think as possible, because the player is supposed to spend most of the time in the puzzle thinking. Furthermore, it's also important to not have very many steps in your puzzle. Like, I understand that by backwards induction, you can just keep adding an arbitrary number of steps to a puzzle, but remember that whenever the player makes a mistake for whatever reason, just malfunction, or they just like mishandle something or whatever, they have to replay parts of your puzzle that they've already solved, which is usually considered tedious busy work. For example, if I have a 2-minute solution and I make a mistake 1 minute in, then I have to replay a minute of level. One main way to get around this restriction is to put like mini save points in your puzzle level. So for example, in this puzzle level, I have all sorts of hard blocks where there's like these small mini challenges to break open a hard block to reveal more parts of the level. And even though I have these reset doors, every time I go through one, these blocks are permanently destroyed, which saves progress in the level forever, even though I don't have a checkpoint here. Another recommendation is that whenever you build a puzzle, as you build different steps and different setups, work compactly. You want to kind of like make each individual mechanism as small as possible so that you can hold as much information on the screen as you can. So first, make a setup that works, then see if you can scale it down or make it not take that much space slowly as you build the level, and then you'll find that it's a lot easier to kind of put the pieces together later. Furthermore, when you have a very complex puzzle with a lot of parts, it's helpful to kind of trap the player in a small space that is relevant to them so they don't have access to the entire puzzle right from the get-go. So here, for example, even though the puzzle has all sorts of different rooms, I'm blocking off access, so you can only really go over here. And from this room, you can only really activate this on-off switch. And we can slowly open up access to different regions of this puzzle level. This technique is extremely powerful when you have a very difficult step in a level, where it's a lot easier to figure out you have to do something that might not be obvious when you are stuck in a room with literally no other option. Let's go over all the really common mistakes or like bad things you generally don't want to find in puzzle levels or want to mitigate as much as possible. The first is self-destruct locks. A self-destruct lock is a situation where you can no longer win in a level and you have to kill yourself. Like here, for example, once that P-switch runs out, I'm screwed, all right? I could give myself a little death spike, you know, for in case, you know, for when this happens. That doesn't really solve the problem of I can no longer beat the level if the P-switch runs out on me, right? You see this all the time in puzzle levels. I go into SD locks, especially in puzzle levels, in way more detail in a specific video on self-destruct locks. Go check that out if you're interested. But the long story short is you want to generally avoid SD locks in puzzle levels as much as possible. The best way to generally avoid SD locks is to keep in mind the puzzle pieces that you're working with and whether or not they'll be resettable or be exhausted. So here, for example, I have a mushroom question mark block. If I need a mushroom potentially and I can take damage in the level, then this is one-time use from this block. If I build my whole level around the expectation that I have one access to this mushroom, then that can give me a position where I can no longer beat the level, right? As opposed to a mechanism where we can get an infinite number of mushrooms through this pipe. Now, they're going to be really different. Not every level that uses mushrooms is going to work with both of these mechanisms. But if I start building my level with the question mark block, I can very easily get my level into a position where it's absurdly difficult or just impossible to remove the SD locks, as opposed to if I built my level from the ground up with these mechanisms that will be resettable. The worst type of SD lock is the one where you don't know you're in it. So here, for example, this is a reset door. And normally when you put a reset door in a level, that means that you can just reset the level and still be able to win. However, in this level, if you go through the reset door at a certain point in the level, you are SD locked. So a lot of people, myself included, waste a ton of time in this level because we don't know the level's actually impossible. We're trying to solve an impossible puzzle. So whenever you have an SD lock, especially in a puzzle level, you want to make super clear that the player understands that, because it can also mislead the player into not trying something, or they're not sure if the solution is the right solution, so they never try it ever again. The next main watch out is lethality. In general, you don't want to make it easy to die in a puzzle level. Like here, for example, there's a chain chomp just randomly dashing out at Mario. One of the main drawbacks to lethality, SD locks, and soft locks in a puzzle level is that you have to replay a section that you already know the answer to. For lethality in general, you want to make it really hard to die in a puzzle level. Like here, for example, even though I have these icicles and I have these piranha plants in different places that could damage Mario, he's being showered with power-ups constantly, and they're all positioned in a certain way to make it really difficult for Mario to die. People rarely die to anything but the timer in this puzzle level. It also generally helps to use as few potential damage sources in a puzzle level as possible. Making a fully non-lethal puzzle level is optimal, but not always possible. The next topic is hidden information. Like, for example, in order to beat this puzzle level, you need to hit that hidden block in order to progress. Why? The main problem with hidden information is that you don't actually have all the puzzle pieces available to you because there's information that you cannot know yet. One common example is items in blocks, like especially if the level is going to have an SD lock, where if I activate this block at the wrong time, that could cause me to no longer be able to win in the level. If I have no idea what's inside this block, then I probably have to lose a life just to find out what is inside this block. As opposed to, if the block has an indicator to tell me what's inside, then I don't have to burn lives in order to just discover what's inside. Especially if the puzzle is more complicated, this can be a huge deal. Another common culprit is spawn blocking. So here, for example, I can break that brick block. And oh look, now there's a bill blaster behind it. I've seen several levels where there are spawn blocked bill blasters used to block cheese or alternate routes. And if you plan your route to go through that, but you don't know there's a bill blaster, you're gonna lead to an unfair death on the player's part and lead the player to thinking that, oh, I have a solution when they don't. Again, here, indicators save lives. Another major thing to avoid is jank. Whenever you have a puzzle solution, you want to make sure that the level is built to do it super reliably every single time. Because whenever the player puts in the solution and the level malfunctions because of jank, the most likely situation is that the player will think, oh, that's not actually the solution because it janked up, and then the player will never try that ever again. So this is actually much worse than in the platformer, because when a platformer janks up on you, then the player will kind of understand like there's not really a way forward, it's supposed to be clear or whatever, but it just kind of janked up. But in a puzzle level, that normally leads to the player not just failing in that playthrough, but every consecutive life. Sometimes the player will reason their way out of it, but there's a huge risk whenever jank is involved in a puzzle level. Additionally, when we make puzzle levels, we really don't want to have precise maneuvers. Like here, in order to get this puzzle to go, we have to hit that shelmet with our shelmet head in order to make it go across, hit that POW, which allows us to cross. And by the way, necessary shelmet in a hidden block. Isn't that fun? In general, a puzzle is about knowledge. It's about figuring out the solution, and you want as little of the difficulty of the puzzle level to be associated with your ability to actually perform the steps of the puzzle. So you want to make movement in the puzzle as smooth as possible. You want the steps to flow as easily as possible. In theory, if you know the puzzle solution, it should be trivial. It should be like a baby could be able to actually put in the answer to the puzzle. Another thing is to really not use obscure mechanics when they aren't taught. Like once I got a puzzle level on my stream. The solution required you to throw a Goomba through a wall to collect a key. And it was like some weird glitch that was necessary and not taught in order to beat the level. That it's not a mechanic that belongs in a puzzle level, all right? Whenever you put a mechanic in a puzzle level, you need to think, is this an Uno Mas? Is it a glitch mechanic? Is it something that people could reasonably figure out? Because if the answer to that is no, it does not belong in the puzzle level. Another thing you want to avoid is the player randomly stumbling onto the solution, right? So here, for example, this is a logic gate puzzle level where you basically have to put in some combination with shells, and then they go through logic gates, and you can eventually get the key. The main thing is that we don't want the player to just accidentally stumble upon the solution, right? Because the point of a puzzle level is to have a eureka moment. You do not want brute force to be a good answer. So in this sort of level, you want to make sure that you discourage brute force, and there are different ways to do that. In general, if in playtesting, you find that players aren't really thinking through the answer and they're just kind of like stumbling into the answer by like just bashing their head against the wall until something magically clicks, that's a bad sign. That means you have to do something about that setup because that's not working. Second is to think about de-cheesing a level, because usually you want to de-cheese a level so that you can't just skip the solution. And obviously, usually in playtesting, you want to remove cheese as much as possible. The main way to do that is to use puzzle pieces that have very clearly defined roles and only interact with the other puzzle pieces in a very specific way. Like a POW block that can only really let you go in a door or a clear pipe or something. Another thing is to keep in mind the difference between a cheese and an alt strat that you should allow. Like for example, in this puzzle level, the final solution is some very involved moving of stumps in order to get into that green pipe again. But Grukowski found a way to get in here just walking on a bomb to go through. And you know, instead of punishing the player for leaving that pipe without a master sword, I'm just gonna give it to you because you know what? If the level is hard enough without the cheese, just let them have it, man. Like, as long as the player feels smart, that is mission accomplished for the puzzle. Another thing is to have confusing aesthetics. Like, a lot of times when people try to go a little bit too much with how they decorate a puzzle level, it can have a lot of negative impacts on gameplay because you're not necessarily sure what blocks are puzzle pieces, what semi-solids are actually relevant to the puzzle, etc. And so you want to usually decorate a puzzle very minimally so that it can stay clear what you have to do in the puzzle. For the same reason for aesthetics, usually when you're de-cheesing a puzzle, you don't want to de-cheese a puzzle by adding a bunch of extra mechanics and extra mechanisms that can make a level more confusing. Like I see a lot of people spamming like one-way walls and a bunch of like blocks and all sorts of different like garbage to de-cheese a puzzle level. The number one best tool to de-cheese a puzzle is ground blocks and very basic terrain. Because like, for example, I can't actually jump over here, right? I need to have access to a blue lava lift to get on top of this semi-solid. And I've rigged it up just by putting the ground blocks here in a certain way to make that impossible. Just remember that terrain is your biggest de-cheesing tool. Furthermore, we want to avoid red herrings as much as possible, all right? Because red herrings normally add artificial difficulty to a puzzle level. Like here, for example, that fire flower is actually completely unnecessary to beat the level. There's no reason, you don't need it at all, but I put it there, which kind of wastes the player's time thinking about how it's used in the solution. In general, if your puzzle level needs a red herring in order to be difficult and challenging, then it's not a very good puzzle. Another big no-no for puzzle level design is to have too many items, especially too many unique items. Like here, if you have access to all 4 of these items, a snowball, a P-switch, a POW block, and a spring, what happens is that first, the player needs to consider a lot of different options of how these items combine together. Or if there's a combination, it becomes a lot harder to figure out what that combination is in a way that can become really intractable. Having a lot of items can be, in its best case, very tedious for the player to hold up because you have to move a lot of items from one place to another, back and forth, and it can just be obnoxious. Very last thing is that having too many items leads you to do a lot of de-cheesing. Like, because there are a lot of options, when you have a lot of puzzle pieces, a lot of items, it leads to the player being able to do a lot of different things that they might not think that they could possibly do because you didn't think of all the different possibilities of how you can combine the different pieces that you gave them. And usually you want to keep the number of puzzle pieces very small and use those puzzle pieces, reuse them in a couple of different ways. So instead of using 4 different items, use maybe 2 of them and they get used a couple of times in different ways. As a closing note, you have to understand when you can bend the rules or break the rules in order to make an idea work. Like for example, in this puzzle level, it's not non-lethal because the whole level revolves around the mechanic where you break an icicle, which allows springs to fall. So Mario needs to be able to take damage. This breaks my rule about lethality, but remember that first, is it absolutely necessary to have this lethality for this level idea? Yes, it is. And second, is there anything we can do to mitigate that? So the main issue with lethality is that it's really obnoxious to die in a puzzle level because something kills you, all right? And then you lose progress because you touch a spike or whatever. The way that I put the icicles in this puzzle level was to give the player as much opportunity to not get hit as possible. Like here, you can't even accidentally run into this clear pipe. You have to go on this donut block in order to even be able to go into and touch that icicle. I have levels that break some of these rules, and it's not like a hard and fast rule of you can't ever do something like blah blah. We need to understand why these are general rules that you should follow, so you don't have the player constantly dying to an icicle and constantly losing their progress, right? In general, if you have to break too many of those don't do this in order to make a puzzle idea work, that puzzle idea is probably not a good idea. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. Thank you for tuning in. If you like this content, feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll see you around next time. Later.